Everybody, today we have a tutorial. I will be doing the burned napkin decoupage technique, but I'll be using my own DIY tissue paper. So this is just dollar store, regular white tissue paper. It has a glossier side and a matte side, and I'll be doing it on the matte side. Now, the benefit of creating your own tissue or napkin to decoupage onto these signs is that you can customize the size and you can customize it, the colors and the patterns. All you need are some stencils, some stamps, and permanent ink, as well as acrylic paint. So I played around and I got a color scheme and pattern that I really like. So I'm going to apply paint with a makeup sponge through this Fantangle stencil. I'm using light blue permanent, and then I'll be coming back and adding more with bright aqua. I did put a little bit of water on the makeup sponge, but you don't want it sopping wet. You also don't want globs of paint. You can do this on a napkin. The napkin will absorb more moisture more readily and will become more fragile, which is why I've gone with tissue paper here. I will put a link in the top right hand corner, in the iCards, to the step-by-step for the burned napkin technique video that I did. And though you'll get lots more tips and tricks for it, as well as ideas of ways that you can use this technique in your art. So I'm simply adding this blue and this aqua, almost like a base color. I didn't want as much white coming through. I wanted a little bit more of a blue tone behind because I'm going to be putting snowflakes on for this Let It Snow sign. Now the signs that I'm going to be covering today, again, were both purchased at the Dollar Tree. So the tissue paper as well as the wooden signs, all from Dollar Tree. I did give a coat of white gesso to the sign. I brayered it on and I let it dry overnight. Now I'm thinking I want a little bit more solid color on the background, so I turned the stencil and I'm applying another layer of this blue paint. Now you will still see some of this pattern and in the end, although it will be pushed back when I stencil on the snowflakes. Now I'm using white tissue paper. I could have started with blue tissue paper and then stenciled it on. So it's all a matter of what you personally like. Here I colored the paper blue, the tissue paper. I painted it blue with a makeup sponge and then applied it. So you have options. You just don't want to get the tissue paper too wet. I love being able to use my stencils in yet one more way. If you had a 12 by 12 stencil or a larger stencil, it'll cover a larger area. It might be a little easier. You just really want to make sure that your stencils don't move too terribly much. because you want to get a fairly good impression, especially in the next step when I'm doing the snowflakes. So I'm quite happy with what I have here for the first layer of pattern. And so I'm picking my colors. I picked quinacridone magenta, Prussian blue, and this neon green. I'm also going to be adding turquoise at a later date. So I'm just putting this on in my container, and then I'm going to grab a different makeup sponge for each one, and I'm going to start putting down the snowflakes. This is a cake and cookie stencil from the Crafter's Workshop, but I chose it because I don't have the 6-inch Fluries stencil, and I wanted the smaller snowflakes. So here I'm just going to layer up Prussian blue snowflakes, quinacridone magenta snowflakes, neon green, and I don't really have a plan for application. I'm overlapping. I just want all over flurries. I didn't wait for the paint to dry and I didn't clean it off the stencil. That's why some of my pink snowflakes here are a little bit colored. They've picked up some of that dark blue. So if you want to avoid that, you just clean off your stencil or wait for it to completely dry. I love this pop of neon green in here. It's slightly unexpected, but it adds so much. I love the idea of this being able to 100% customize the patterns and the colors so you can match it to whatever you want in your decor. I could have done this just black and white. That would have been very pretty. And the sky's the limit. Or you're only limited by the stencils or stamps in your stash. And then just like a bit of a peek here to see how that's going to look. And here I believe I'm adding the turquoise color. Thought something was missing, so I'm just adding one more color. Now, as I continue on doing all 4 quadrants of this tissue paper, I do basically apply it in the same colors. So I go Prussian blue, the pink, the neon green, and then the turquoise. Just so it looks very much the same. If you do it in any other order, you're just going to get a slightly different look. There we have more snowflakes. I like how that's going to cover more of the letters of the sign. Now this one, the Let It Snow sign, you can glue this onto a canvas or a wood panel and then do a background and have kind of a 3D elements coming out. You could stick it into a wreath. You could use it as a wall hanging as it is. My plan is to put this in a wreath that I have yet to develop. So now I've gone ahead and I've filled up the area, and I've decided that I'm going to add some Prussian blue and some quinacridone magenta splatters to this. Now you can make this designer tissue paper and then use this in an art journal. So whatever I have left over here will be stuck into my stash and it will find its home onto another or onto an art journal page or another project. So none of this is going to go to waste. So I've splattered with quinacridone magenta and Prussian blue, and you know what? I gotta do it. I have to add some bling with some gold splatter as well. And I love how the gold looks on here. Now that I've splattered, this is going to take a bit of time to dry. Look at that yumminess. So we're on to the next one. So now I also picked up this Peace on Earth, and my plan is to put it in this wreath. But I wanted that color of the poinsettia down below, so I can customize that. I'm going to use alizarin crimson with a touch of black. Here's the sample that I did to get that color. And I'm going to use this endless scroll stencil. I'll list them down below. And I'm going to do this now on tissue paper while the other one's drying. So I'm taking a alizarin crimson, slightly damp makeup sponge, just slightly, with a little bit of black. And then I'm stenciling through endless swirls, I believe. I chose this because it just had that vintage feel that would go with the wreath that I have hanging on my front door. You'll see the picture of the finished wreath with the wood hanging. And when I said I put a little bit of black, it's just a little bit of black. Just enough to tone it down to make it look more vintage. Doesn't this make a beautiful pattern? The colors here are more true to how this actually turned out. The pictures in the final pictures look very dark. And there we have, I'm just going to add a little bit more as it's a little bit tight. Now stenciling onto the tissue paper takes a bit of time. I've sped up this part of the video, but I want you to know you just go slowly and carefully. You don't want too much paint. You don't want too much water. Loving that. Now I decided that because I wanted to go more vintage, I wanted kind of a parchment paper look coming through. So I grab my unbleached titanium and I start painting with the brush, and then I think, oh, I bet this will work better with the makeup sponge. And yes, it totally went on very quick and easy. In part because this had already been gessoed, so the wood is basically primed. And I grabbed my French script stamp and my black archival ink, and I'm just adding a little bit of script, another little detail in here. Because script for me goes so well with that vintage feel. And you can see how great this is. And I just do this throughout the whole patterned area. So now we're ready to glue down the tissue papers, our designer tissue papers, onto the wooden signs. I'm using a glue stick. This is from the stationery store Staples. I've also used the Elmer's glue one. I'm using the larger one. I find it's easier to get on. And you want to make sure you've got good coverage, especially all the corners. You don't want it to be loose there. So I'm going over this, and I think I go over it a couple times, getting a good coat of glue stick. And here I'm just going over, but you got to work pretty quickly. This is in real time, but you don't want it to dry. And then you're going to position it and press it down. Now, don't make the mistake I did where I used the bone folder. That it caused it to rip. So using the brayer or just your hand and pressing it down, making sure all the edges are down, works really well. The brayer works very well. And I'm just pressing it down, making sure all the corners are fully adhered. And I'll be checking later as well. So I'm getting my cutting mat and turning this upside down and grabbing a sharp X-Acto knife. And I'm cutting off the majority of the excess. I'm not going right next to the wood. That's what that burn decoupage technique will take care of that. And you want to have enough for it to burn, but you don't want excess because then you're going to end up with a bigger flame and more ashes and more likelihood of having something get out of hand. So I'm going to go all the way around the sign, and then all those little inner parts. You need to break them and get rid of the excess. And this was the best way I've discovered to do that. I even cut all the way inside that snowflake with the X-Acto knife, and it worked really well. When you're picking a wooden sign to do this technique with, or a metal sign, you don't want the tiny opening. See the middle of the snowflake there? That's almost too small. I did cut it out so it's open, but it doesn't work really well for it to get burned out, I've found. So you don't want things with too tiny of openings. Slow and steady wins the race. So here, this middle part, you need to cut this part and open. It's impossible for you to get scissors in here. So the X-Acto knife works great. So I continue and I get all of it cut out. Now I'm checking the corners. Remember I said you want this to be down. If I'd burnt this as it is, that would burn off. And then I'd have part of that edge showing. So I'm just going to go to all the corners and make sure, double check that it is glued down. And just add a little bit of glue and press it back down in case. So I'm going to do that with both of the signs. Step by step. This will save you a lot of headache later on, so take your time and do it right. Now that it's all glued down, now we're going to light it. And you're going to always want to light it from the bottom. I sprayed the paper underneath with water, and I have my spray bottle there just in case something goes wrong. And you just light it, and you can see it burns it right to the edge. Just turn it, watch where you're going, and always from the bottom. And it cuts it right to the end, right to the edge. And you're just going to work your way around and do it for all the areas. If you put the flame from the top, it will discolor your paper. So always from the bottom for the back. And then take a brush and just brush off all the ash. And you want to get rid of this, especially if you've kept any white on there, because the ash would discolor it. Just rubbing it off gently. And you can see how it's discolored part of it in the background. You could paint the back if you wished. You could use a brayer and give it a coat of paint if you so choose. I'm not. There we had a part that wasn't completely adhered, so I'm just adding some tissue back in it, gluing it down, and then burning off the excess. So if that happens, you can always patch it up. So let's do this one. I've really sped this up. It's just so magical watching this. You light it and it just cleans it all up. I know when I first saw this technique, it was like, no, that can't really be. It's not that simple. It is that simple. It's like magic. It's especially good if you're going with the vintage route because you get that ash. And here I have a couple spots that something happened, so I'm just gluing down more of the tissue paper, and you can't even tell. Now I'm edging this with black, and I'm using the Ranger blending foams. Now, of course, it's going to be impossible to get the center areas, but I've got that covered. Before I went any further, I decided I'm going to give my signs a good coat of fluid matte medium. This is going to turn the tissue paper into a non-porous surface, and the shading that I'm going to do is going to show up and it's not going to soak into the paper. This will also glue down any parts that maybe aren't 100% glued down. So here I'm doing it with the Let It Snow sign. And I'm just working my brush in. If there's any little bits that didn't get burnt off, they're getting glued down. Now I'm going to add some shading to bring out the letters. I'm using the floating acrylic shading technique that you've seen me use at pretty much every project. And I'm just making those letters stand out. This again is another step that takes time. Now, I chose to do this with black, but I'm kind of thinking at this point that's making it a little bit more grungy than what I wanted. I'm wishing that I had done it in the color that I did the stenciling, that muted burgundy. Then I grab my black Posca pen once it's dry, and I'm just outlining it kind of sketchily. And I will give this a coat of Minwax polycrylic varnish since it's going outside. And that'll make it a little glossy. Here I'm just splattering with gold because there's gold in my wreath. Love it. So because I had thought about using that color, using the burgundy color there, I decided for this one, I'm not going black. I'm going to go with the Prussian blue, and I'm shading the letters with it. And I just keep turning my piece so I get easy access to it. I was really happy with how this one turned out. I just love the colors. There are close-ups of this, of the of both of the signs, and the one I put it into the wreath. So to do the burned napkin decoupage technique, you can use tissue papers. I even used colored coffee filters, and that worked. It burned as well. So you have options. Use napkins, create some on your own tissue papers. or on the whites of the napkin, or on coffee filters. You're only limited by the stencils and stamps and colors in your stash. At this point, I wasn't happy with how that snowflake instead of the O was standing out, kind of got lost. So I grabbed some white gesso and a brush, and I'm giving it several coats of the white gesso till I get the bright white that I want. I just figure that it looks like it shows up so much better this way. I may decide to put a iridescent medium or shimmery goodness on there. So once it's all dry, I grab my white Posca pen and I'm going to outline all the letters in the white. I love how the white really shows up on the shading from the blue. Adding another coat of white to make it bright. And then continuing to outline the letters. And as you can see, it's not overly perfect. Once this is completely dry, I'll give this a coat of the polyacrylic varnish as well. And when I get the wreath done, if I get the wreath done, I will post it on Instagram. For now, the sign's going to go join my snowman collection. And here are the close-ups. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you give this burnt napkin decoupage technique a try. It really works well. There's the wreath. I'm so happy with how it turned out. And there's the Let It Snow sign. Until next time, go get creative.